physiology of the urinary system. Okay, and so yeah, so this one is kind of how we regulate our total body fluid as well as our urine amounts and concentrations. Okay, and so we'll dive into kind of the hormonal control of this, the nervous system control of this, and all of that today. Okay, so this is just a little graphic that kind of shows us where all the water in our bodies is, right? You've heard it said that we're mostly water, right? We're at least 2/3 water, something like that. Also happens to be that the world is 2/3 water, something like that, right? Probably even more like 70%. But when it comes to our body water, we have around 40 liters of water inside of us, okay? And that's about 60% of our body weight is from water, okay? But then when we look at that total amount of water, it can really be in 3 different places. Right, we've kind of talked about those 3 spaces already in the body, right? We've talked about inside of cells, outside of cells, or so in the outside would be the either interstitial fluid or plasma volume, and then that 3rd one, the one on the right, is part of outside of cells, but it's in the blood, right? Okay, so the vast majority of our water is inside of our cells, right? And that's what this shows here. Okay, so 40% of our body weight is from the water inside of our cells. Okay, so that's over half of our total water is inside of our cells. Okay, and then our extracellular fluid is about 20% of our body weight. Okay, and then of that extracellular fluid, about 80% of it is just in that interstitial space. Right, so it's the space that's not in the cell, not in a blood vessel, but somewhere else. Right, and then about 20% of that is in our plasma volume in our blood. Okay, so it just kind of is where the water's at in our bodies. Okay, so in that water is very important, especially in the extracellular space and intracellular space, the level of ions. And we've been talking about these ions for the whole year in this class, right? Not even just recently, but all the way back in the fall, we started talking about sodium levels and potassium levels, okay? So sodium is known as a primary determinant of tonicity in the body, okay? And it's regulated primarily by that proximal tubule, right? Because remember, that was the first place after we create the filtrate, 60% of our water comes back here, and then sodium goes with that, right? So most of our sodium is reabsorbed right here, okay? We also know the distal tubule does some of this too, right? The distal tubule can help us bring back some sodium as well, okay? And we know that if we have high levels of aldosterone, then we bring back even more sodium because we're kind of telling the distal tubule to bring back more sodium. Okay, so higher levels of aldosterone means we bring back more sodium. We hold on to more sodium. Okay, so again, that's a key thing, that sodium is the primary determinant of tonicity. And really what another thing to say about it is it's the primary ion of the extracellular space. Okay, so that's the one we expect to see the most of outside of cells. Okay, the one that we expect to see the most of inside of cells, at least on the positive side of ions and cations, is potassium. Okay, and potassium is going to be brought back some in the kidneys by the proximal tubule, because potassium actually comes back with sodium and water when we bring back all that stuff in the proximal tubule. Okay, but then in the distal tubule, it's different, right? We talked about in the distal tubule, we have this exchange system for sodium and potassium. Right, so for bringing back more sodium in the distal tubule, that means we're putting more potassium into the urine. Okay, and again, this is regulated by aldosterone. So if we have more aldosterone on board, then we excrete more potassium and we reabsorb more sodium. Okay. All right, so those 2 ions are obviously very, very crucial for many different functions, but definitely crucial for the function of our body as far as in terms of how much water we hold on to as well. Okay. All right. So this is a question I want you guys to think about for a second, and I'm going to send you guys. All right. So make sure to send in those answers on your app there. So you're just sending in all of the ones that are true here, and make sure you hit submit or send, whatever that is. Looks like there's a few more of you that need to do that. Only 48 so far. Okay, and so we're going to talk about how all these things work in just a second here for the rest of class, but it's just kind of a preview into that. I wanted to look at all of these. So which of the following lead to an increase in blood pressure? Okay, so an increase in blood pressure is always related to holding on to more water, right? And probably holding on to more sodium too, right? So the things that would lead to the kidneys holding on to more water, holding on to more sodium would be a part of this. Also, we can increase blood pressure by making the pipes that the water is in smaller too, right? So that's one of these as well, right? So we can either make the pipe smaller or we can just hold on to more fluid, right? And so that's pretty much encompasses the different ones here, okay? So this might become very tricky to try to get anything understandable out of this. Yep, I think the highest is 8% there, because we have some commas, which makes a different answer and different things. So that's okay. All right, so let's walk through these together a little bit here. Okay, so increase in blood pressure. So would increase in ADH increase blood pressure or decrease blood pressure? Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, just right here in class. Okay, yeah, good, for sure, because that's going to cause us to hold on to more water, right? ADH causes us to hold on to more water, so it's going to increase blood pressure. Okay, ANP, we haven't talked about that one, but that one does the opposite of pretty much everything else. Yeah, ANP pretty much causes you to get rid of water, get rid of sodium. Okay, so for that one, we're going to say the other one. We need to decrease ANP to help us increase blood pressure. Okay, so then we got increase. So obviously, increase ANP isn't. Next one, increase sympathetic nervous system activity. This has the effect of shrinking down the pipes, right? So this one would increase blood pressure for sure. Okay, angiotensin 2. This one is going to act a little bit more directly on the salt side of things. Okay, and it's going to cause us to hold on to more sodium. Also indirectly causes to hold on to more water too. So that one definitely increases blood pressure, and it has the effect of shrinking the pipes too. So that's actually the one that does everything. Okay, and we'll talk about that one more in a second. Okay, and then increased aldosterone for sure as well. Okay, so those are our big ones there. Let me make sure I didn't mess any of those up. I did have it in the notes here. A, C, D, E, G. Got it. Okay, good. Any questions about those? Okay, cool. So let's start talking about each of them. Okay, let's start with ADH. Okay, and luckily we've already talked about ADH. So you guys all know what gland releases it, right? Because you're all ready for the final next week. Which gland was that? Posterior pituitary. You got it for sure. Okay, and there's two different kind of ways that we can stimulate its release. Okay, I wasn't meaning to scare anybody by saying you're all ready for the exam. You got a little time to study, but yeah. Okay, so two different stimuli. Okay, the stimulus could be related to the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid. Okay, so how concentrated our extracellular fluid is, or it could be related to our blood pressure. Okay, so if it's the osmolarity one, that's going to be detected by osmoreceptors up in the brain, in the hypothalamus. Okay, if that extracellular fluid becomes too hypertonic, right, meaning less water, more solute, then we increase ADH concentration. That would mean that our extracellular fluid is getting dried up a little bit, right? We have less water and more solute. Okay, so we need more ADH so we can hold on to more water. If it goes the other way, if we got too much water, not as much solute, then the ADH decreases. Okay, on the blood pressure side of things, if we have low blood pressure, then it most likely is related to the fact that we might have low blood volume too, right? So if we got low blood volume, that's going to be detected by baroreceptors. Okay, baroreceptors are little mechanical receptors that detect blood pressure all over the body. Okay, we have these in our atria, our large veins, carotid sinuses, that aortic arch part that we talked about before. Okay, so if we have a low blood pressure detected, That's going to cause an increase in ADH. Okay, so it's either that our extracellular fluid is very hypertonic or we have low blood pressure. Both of those are stimulators for this. And then what happens when it's released? Well, ADH increases water permeability in the collecting duct, right? Oops, where was that one? Oh yeah, sorry, increased ADH. Okay, and so then that means more water is reabsorbed, right? We already learned when we talked about the endocrine system that ADH causes more water reabsorption. Now we just know enough about the kidneys to tell you exactly how it does that, right? It causes the collecting duct to be more open to water passing through it, right? So when it goes by that strong concentration gradient that was created by that counter current multiplier mechanism and all of that, more water is able to pass through. Okay, it also increases water permeability in the distal tubule, so we can pull some more water back there too. So the overall effect of that is we lose less water in the urine. All right, back to me taking my friend's nose squirt and I didn't pee for 12 hours. Remember that? Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So the negative feedback of this is like what would slow down the release of ADH would be either just reversing the two stimuli, right? Either we decrease the osmolarity of the blood or we increase the blood pressure, and that reverses the stimuli and decreases the release of ADH. Okay, so that's our ADH one. Any questions about that so far? Most of that's, we've learned it before, all right? Okay, so a few things about ADH. ADH is affected by alcohol intake, okay? Alcohol intake, alcohol is known as a diuretic, right? Just like coffee is a diuretic, or caffeine is a diuretic, right? So how does alcohol do it? It actually goes to your brain and blocks the posterior pituitary from releasing ADH. Okay, so it acts up in the brain by stopping ADH from being released. Okay, so so the collecting duct and the distal tubule don't reabsorb as much water, so more water just passes through. Okay, doesn't really change our electrolyte balance too much, but it definitely can dehydrate us. Okay, so other diuretics that kind of act on the ADH pathway, a very common one called Lasix, also known as furosemide, is what's known as a loop diuretic. Okay, super common with patients who have cardiovascular disease or heart failure. You'll see people on Lasix all the time. And what it does is it blocks salt reabsorption, sodium reabsorption in the ascending loop of Henle. All right, so remember we go down, descending, water's coming out, we go back up, ascending, sodium is getting pumped out, right? So we just block those little pumps that are doing that, and that messes up that whole cycle and that whole countercurrent multiplier mechanism, right? So if that's not happening, we don't create that strong concentration gradient next to the collecting duct, and we don't pull as much water out when the filtrate passes, right? So obviously all drugs that are created are, you got to know the physiology to be able to do that, right? So that's pretty fascinating if you think about it, right? That we had to figure out that whole little mechanism first about that whole countercurrent multiplier, all that different stuff, and then they identified that protein and thought, well, what kind of chemical can we make that sticks to that protein and makes it so it doesn't work anymore, right? And that's what they found out. And so yeah, all drugs are some variation of that, right? But that one's just kind of a cool one. So yeah, so any questions on how that works? And there's lots of loop diuretics like this. That's not the only one, but loop diuretics are diuretics that just mess up something in the loop of Henle to make it change how it works. Okay, so another thing that is related to this is the different type of diabetes, not diabetes mellitus, right? We talked about diabetes insipidus a little bit. This is the one where you have the tasteless urine, right? I mentioned that where the doctors would taste the urine. If it's not sweet, if it's just really watery, then they have diabetes insipidus instead of diabetes mellitus. Problem with this one is there's either no ADH release or just too low of ADH release, or the ADH receptors in the kidneys are not there. Okay, so this creates an incredible amount of urine, up to 20 liters a day. And this is definitely a life-threatening illness if it's not treated. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so ADH is just kind of our pathway. we've seen something just like this before, right? So if we start up with A, the stimulus, right? Those stimuli are the ones we were just talking about. So either increase in osmolality of the extracellular fluid, okay? Or we would add in the blood pressure one, right? The low blood pressure, and this is all on those previous slides, right? Receptors that are going to read that would either be the osmoreceptors if we're talking about the osmolarity one, or it would be those baroreceptors if we're talking about the blood pressure one. Okay, so then C, there we go, that's the other receptor, so the baroreceptors. Okay, D is the gland. We know what the gland was. We're just talking about this. This is the posterior pituitary. Right, it releases the hormone here, which is ADH. Okay, the target of that hormone is the kidneys. Right, so where does it act? It acts directly on the collecting duct of the kidneys, also a little bit on the distal tubule, but has a stronger effect on the collecting duct. So then the immediate effect of this is we increase water reabsorption. Right, we hold on to more water. And the overall effect of holding on to more water is, first of all, our urine volume goes down. And then we just reverse this, right? So our extracellular fluid osmolality goes down, right? We start diluting out our extracellular fluid. And then that, sorry, I kind of crossed out that bottom one, I didn't mean to. And that just says increases our plasma volume, right? We end up with more fluid in our blood. Yeah, and so that negative feedback is just reversing the two stimuli, right? It would either be increasing our blood pressure back up, or it would be diluting our extracellular fluid. Both of those things would bring negative feedback for the release of ADH, so we would start releasing less ADH. Okay, any questions on ADH and its actions in the kidneys and helping us balance water, and mainly water and blood pressure? Okay. Give me one more sec to finish writing. See a couple of you still writing. Okay. All right, so that's ADH. Now let's talk about this whole other system known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And so we talked about this one before, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail on how it works here. Okay, so renin is released by the kidneys, right? But it's specifically by those granular cells in that thing that we'll just call the JGA for the rest of today, which is that juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, remember those two special types of cells there? The granular cells are the ones that are reading blood pressure, right? They're sensing blood pressure. Okay, so stimuli for renin's release is going to be decreased blood pressure sensed by those granular cells. Okay, or it could also be low sodium concentration that's sensed by those macula densa cells, right? Those are those two special cells in the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, and this makes a lot of sense, right? If we have a little organ that is helping us control the level of water in our body, but it also happens to receive 20% of our cardiac output, makes a lot of sense to put these little receptors here, put cells here that help us regulate these things, right? Okay, so the chain of events here, this is where you're getting a little bit more detail than you did before. Okay, so renin is not a hormone, really, it's actually an enzyme. Okay. And so when renin is released, it's going to interact with a protein that's always in our blood called angiotensinogen. Okay, and that angiotensinogen is just one of our regular plasma proteins. It's always there. It's made by the liver, like a lot of our plasma proteins are. Okay, so that when renin interacts with angiotensinogen, it cleaves it, turns it into angiotensin 1. Okay, and then angiotensin 1 is just floating around through our blood. Okay, then it's going to interact with an enzyme that's also always in our blood. Okay, and it's going to turn it into angiotensin 2. That enzyme is called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. And that ACE is made by the cells in our lungs. And again, ACE is just always floating around through our blood. And if it just happens to interact with angiotensin 1, then it cleaves it and turns it into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is really the powerful hormone in this whole system. Okay, another really, really common and important drug in cardiovascular disease and patients with high blood pressure is a drug called an ACE inhibitor. Okay, so some of your parents or grandparents may be on drugs, a drug called lisinopril. Any of those drugs that have that "il" on the end typically are ACE inhibitors, and what they do is they block this guy right here. Okay, and they block the ACE enzyme from doing its job, and so by doing that, they don't allow for the formation of angiotensin II. Okay, and if you look at all of these things that angiotensin II does, they're all related to raising your blood pressure. Right, so people with high blood pressure, if we could stop the formation of angiotensin II in their body to some extent, then their blood pressure would go down, right? And that's why those ACE inhibitors are so popular and such good drugs for lowering blood pressure. Okay, so there's all the effects of angiotensin II. Oops, sorry, causes us to be thirsty, also causes us to crave salt. It directly stimulates more ADH release, stimulates aldosterone release, and it also activates our sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to cause vasoconstriction, right? So all those things are related to either holding on to more water, more salt, or shrinking down our blood vessels. Okay, and it also has effects right in the as far with our GFR. So it constricts the efferent arteriole. We haven't really talked about that one too much yet, but when water goes in, or blood goes in the afferent arteriole of the glomerulus and then out the efferent. So if we constrict the efferent, then we're pretty much just slowing down the exiting of the blood, so it stays in the glomerulus longer. More water or more fluid gets filtered out, and that increases our GFR. Okay, any questions about that one? Okay, so a couple more details about this. We'll kind of just taking it next down the road, because one of the effects of angiotensin II is to stimulate the release of aldosterone. All right. So again, we've already talked about aldosterone. We know it's released by the adrenal cortex, stimulated to be released by either directly by high potassium levels, but also by angiotensin II, like we just talked about. Okay, its primary action has to do with causing us to hold on to more sodium. And so we reabsorb more sodium, excrete more potassium. Okay, by holding on to more sodium, it also causes us to hold on to some more water too. And just to make things a little bit simpler, I just cut off the part about the efferent arteriole here, so don't worry too much about that. Yeah, I think you guys have that in your notes, right? About the efferent arteriole there, not there? Oh, okay. There's one place where I cut it off. Maybe it wasn't there. Okay, so we constrict the afferent arteriole with aldosterone. Okay, and what that would do would be decrease the amount of blood flow going into the glomerulus, right? So that would actually decrease our filtration a little bit. That would help us to hold on to more fluid. Okay, so the overall results of this are less urine and more dilute urine. Okay, this is the pathway that caffeine acts on. Alcohol was acting on the ADH pathway up in the brain by stopping the release of ADH. Caffeine directly blocks the action of aldosterone on the kidneys. Caffeine gets into your distal tubule, blocks where aldosterone should be binding, and keeps it from having its effect there. And so caffeine is also a diuretic, right? Causes you to urinate more, and that's how. Okay, any questions about this so far? Okay. All right, so let's look at this flow chart here. This flow chart kind of walks us through this process of angiotensin II formation and then all of its effects. Okay, so the color coding can kind of help you with this. Yeah, let's take a couple minutes and see if you guys can kind of make some sense of this. Okay, so look at that color coding there. And then you can also answer this question up here. Okay, so go ahead. Take a second, talk to the person next to you in class, or if you're going to your breakout rooms, then talk to your people in your breakout room. So let's come back together here. Okay, so the stimulus for this whole process, starting this whole renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, is going to be related to blood pressure. right? So that decrease in blood pressure, okay, that's going to be detected by those granular cells in that juxtaglomerular apparatus, okay? And then they're going to release that enzyme, right? What's that enzyme under number 2? Yell it out if you're here in class. I guess that's an action, huh? There we go. Yeah, but it has the name in there too, right? Yeah, they release renin. Okay, those juxtaglomerular cells release renin. Okay, and which protein's coming out of the liver there? That first protein that's just always going to be in our blood. What do we call that one? Over here. What is it? Yeah, that's our angiotensinogen. That's just one of our normal plasma proteins. It's always there. Okay, and then renin's going to go interact with that one, right? Renin's going to be the enzyme that converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Okay, and then that angiotensin 1 is going to interact with ACE, which is also always just floating around in our blood, that angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay, and so renin converts angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1. Okay, and then ACE turns angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, and 4 is just saying that ACE turns angio 1 into angio 2. Okay, so now we've made angiotensin 2. Now it has all kinds of effects, right? Angiotensin 2 has multiple effects. Okay, so 5B talks about how it promotes vasoconstriction of blood vessels. Okay, it does this via the actions of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so this helps increase our blood pressure. Okay, 5C is another action. So that promotes reabsorption of sodium. Okay, 5D causes aldosterone release. Okay, and that's going to act on that distal tubule to cause us to hold on to more sodium. Okay, and then 5E, this is causing us to be thirsty. And it doesn't even have it here, but also causing ADH release, right? And so the actions are worded slightly different here than they were on the slide 2 slides ago. So just go with the one that was on the slide 2 slides ago. It ends this up at the same place for the most part, but yeah, don't let the different wording here confuse you too much. Okay, so then our overall result is we get an increase in systemic blood pressure. Okay, any questions about that one? Oh yeah, let's see what you guys said here. Yeah, so about 70% of you are saying C. So that would be the lungs, right? And that's the one I was going for there. Where does the enzyme that forms angiotensin 2 come from? Comes from the lungs. That's that ACE enzyme. Okay, but obviously renin's an important enzyme that's a part of this process too. So as long as you know what they both do, then you're fine. Okay, any questions about any of that? All right. Okay, so real briefly here, one more hormone to talk about is this ANP1, this atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, it actually comes from the cells in the right atrium. Okay, this comes from our heart. Okay, and the stimulus for it to be released is when that right atrium gets stretched out too much. Okay, this can be due to high blood pressure or high blood volume. Okay, so very common in heart failure patients to have high ANP levels. It's actually a marker of heart failure because you hold on to too much fluid with heart failure and you can't get that fluid out of your heart. So it's just stretching out your heart. Okay, and it pretty much does the opposite of everything we've been talking about so far. Blocks ADH release, blocks renin release, blocks aldosterone release. So it slows down our sodium reabsorption. It dilates our arteries instead of constricts them. Okay, and then maybe this was the one that I changed a little bit. Oh yeah, I didn't change it, never mind. Yeah, so constriction of the efferent arterioles, dilation of the afferent. Don't worry too much about the stuff that I mentioned on the efferent one this time. Let's just focus on the afferent one because that's all we had talked about before. So by dilating those afferent arterioles, we are sending more blood into the glomerulus. And so our overall result of this is less water and sodium retention, right? That's helping us get rid of a lot of fluid by doing this. Okay, so we lower our blood pressure and we lower our blood volume. Okay, so this one's making us get rid of a lot of fluid. Okay, so AMP, we can kind of walk through this here. What effect does it have on ADH? It decreases it. What effect would it have on renin? It would decrease it. Aldosterone, it would decrease it. What effect does it have on the afferent arterioles? It dilates them. Okay, and that's going to lead to an increase in GFR, right, which would lead to increased urine. Okay, so the overall effect is we lose more water and sodium in the urine. Okay, so this is pretty much kind of doing the opposite of what we just talked about with ADH, with renin, and with aldosterone. Okay, oops, sorry. Any questions there? All right, so the last factor that affects all of this is our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, when our sympathetic nervous system activates, how does it affect our afferent arterioles? It causes them to vasoconstrict. Okay, which that would cause the blood flow to our glomerulus to decrease, right? We're sending less blood into our glomerulus. So what would that do to our hydrostatic pressure in our glomerulus? It would decrease it. So what would that do to our, how much we filter, our GFR? That would decrease that, okay? So we're making less urine when we're stressed out, right? Makes sense. Something we've talked about multiple times already. Okay, so we've got all these hormonal ways to control urine. We've got the nervous system way to control it here. Okay, now what, and this is just to kind of help us understand the effects of that changing the size of the afferent arteriole. And the book has a nice analogy that talks about either turning up the faucet or turning down the faucet. So if we vasoconstrict right there, that'd be kind of the equivalent of turning down the faucet, right? We're sending less fluid into that glomerulus. Okay, if we vasodilate, making these bigger, that would be having the effect of turning up the faucet, sending higher blood pressure into that glomerulus, making more filtrate, also making more urine. Okay, so there's a nice little concept boost on that on page 961 if you want. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Okay, okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left here, and what I'd like to do is walk us through these kind of integrated responses. So let's kind of put all of the dots together here. Okay, so we've got two different kinds of disruptions. Okay, the disruption in our body fluid or salt levels is what we're talking about. Okay, and so first of all, our first disruption that we're going to talk about dealing with is the disruption of osmolarity. Okay, so if we increase the osmolarity of our extracellular fluid, meaning that we don't have, or meaning that we just have a higher content of salt than we normally would. Okay, so this would be sensed by those osmoreceptors, both in the hypothalamus and that juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, and just pause for a second. What you want to think about when you think about ADH and then the whole renin pathway, you want to, and you probably want to make a note of this. ADH, we're always thinking ADH is primarily concerned with water levels, and then the whole renin, angiotensin, aldosterone thing, that one is primarily concerned with sodium levels. Okay, so in this case, when we got high osmolarity, that means that we don't have enough water and or we have too much sodium. Okay, so the way that our body would deal with this problem would be to increase our ADH release. All right, so that would help us to hold on to more water. So that would increase water retention. Okay, but then since we probably have too much salt, then we need to decrease renin and the effects of that will be to increase sodium excretion, right? Or we could just say decrease sodium reabsorption. Okay, so the end result of that is more water and less sodium in the body. Okay, so that's how we reverse this issue of high blood osmolarity or extracellular fluid osmolarity. Okay, increase ADH to help us get rid of, or to help us hold on to water, and we decrease renin to help us to get rid of some sodium. Okay, so the end result is more water, less sodium held on to. Okay, so that would be the first kind of integrated response one. Okay. Secondly, just the opposite, right? If we have the other problem where we have decreased osmolarity, okay, again, that's sensed by those osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus and the juxtaglomerular apparatus, okay, and then our two hormones are going to go the opposite directions, right? So ADH is going to go down, okay, so we hold on to less water, okay, and then we got to increase renin, so we hold on to more sodium. Okay, so the end result is less water, more sodium. Okay, so if our osmolarity was too low, that meant we have too much water and not enough salt. So now we hold on to more water, get rid of some salt. Okay. Okay, so that's the osmolarity one. Okay, and now let's look at the other type of disruption, which could be the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid is normal, but we just have too much total volume of blood. Okay, if we got too much blood volume, this is going to be sensed by the baroreceptors now. Okay, lots of different places we have those baroreceptors, and now we don't just mess with ADH and renin, but we mess with the sympathetic nervous system and that ANP. Okay, so we decrease our SNS activity here. Okay, by decreasing sympathetic tone, we're going to decrease vasoconstriction. Okay, so our vessels are going to get a little bit bigger. That would help us lower blood pressure. Okay, we increase atrionatriuretic peptide, so that causes us to block ADH, all right, block renin. Okay, also causes vasodilation. We're going to decrease our ADH, so that would be holding on to less water. All right, we're going to decrease our renin, so that will be holding on to less sodium. Okay, so the final result is we vasodilate, all right, which that would decrease our blood pressure. Okay, we get rid of more water, so we have less water in the body and less sodium. Okay, so the big difference here from the last one is we added in ANP and SNS activity, but we also have renin and ADH going in the same direction, right? Because we don't have an issue with not enough salt versus water. They're kind of together. It's just we have too much fluid, right? Okay, and I'm going to let you guys fill in the last one because it's just pretty much the exact opposite of this, right? So just like we did on the previous one, it's just the exact opposite effects of of this one. Okay, so the next one is too low of blood volume, so everything just goes in the reverse of this. Okay, all right, guys, have a great rest of your day. Good luck on your nursing quiz. Thanks, Rachel. And we'll see you guys on Wednesday for our last in-person class.